Well, welcome to the Resistance and Renewal podcast. I don't even know what number we're on.
I think we're 4. This is episode 4.
This makes it sound like we've done so many. Mm-hmm. It's not really something I can say until we're in the maybe 30s.
30s?
You don't have that.
Wait, what did we?
That did not inform the greatest confidence that you think that we're going to hit such numbers.
Yeah, it's a lot. I don't even know. I don't know who listens to this.
Yeah, I know some people who listen to this.
Hopefully.
My mom listens to this.
Oh, hi, Mom. Heather Anderson says she listens to it.
Yeah,
she's very excited.
Yes. Yeah, you know. Well, it's 2025.
I think if I'm just thinking about talking just to Cheryl and Heather, I'll have a much easier time.
Yeah, there you go. It's 2025. How are you feeling about 2025?
Still the same.
I don't know. That has no context for me or the few people listening.
The 2 people. Yeah, I think our calendar is pretty full, which is neither here nor there. But it's like past that, I don't have any vision. Like I see what I'm scheduled to do, but come June, I don't know what 2025 holds. I don't feel like it has very much color or vision or excitement, but it's not bad. I feel like there's like a
pulling
veil.
Back the curtain a little bit. Emily leads our school biblical studies. She co-leads alongside of me the church that we pastor. She's leading lots of things. And it's really, I think it actually might come back around in this conversation, is in just a unique space where God is clearly talking about the next season, but part of by doing that is almost pushing pause on the immediacy of vision for the next season. And I think it's helpful to talk through, because sometimes I think when people look into the next year and look into the next couple of years and they don't see exactly what it is or exactly what it's going to look like, it feels scary, or it feels like maybe even something's wrong.
Right.
But I've learned a lot of times, and I've known that in some of the seasons of my own life, that part of it is it's how God gets our attention. Sometimes it's massive change. Sometimes it's such small change, but what it means is there's something he's after. And I think part of the way he pulls us to get our attention is he almost withholds a little bit of what is coming so that we pursue him. So I think you're in that season, and we've talked a lot about that, but that's what 2025 feels like.
Kind of feels like there's like a grayish veil over my eyes for the future, but I'm not worried, scared, upset. Like I'm not feeling any emotion about it. I just am like, well, I can't see. And I have pretty bad eyes. For more context, I have a negative 8.5.
I didn't know it existed until I met you.
So I'm very aware of not being able to see and what it looks like. It's like
if you
in the fiber of my DNA is not seeing clearly.
This is gonna throw back for people. But have you ever seen the cartoon Mr. Magoo? Who is infamously, blind but doesn't recognize it. When Emily doesn't have her contacts or glasses in, that's basically what you become. I just think about what that would mean for you in an ancient world.
I think about that sometimes. I also think about what if I could wake up seeing how much more my life would be different, and lest you hear this and say, isn't there surgery for that? Not for me.
Yeah.
Too bad. They're like, we could do it and you would still need glasses or contacts. We could get you to like a -5.
I still remember one of the times you went to the doctor and they're like, you should avoid roller coasters.
Yeah. They were like, it's going to.
And we're like, what do you mean? And apparently you're part of what makes your vision so bad is that your eyes are shaped in a certain way that they're like more rounded or
more oblong.
More oblong,
they're
something.
Like, this is going to gross people out.
Like, this is the worst introduction to, we're never hitting 30 with introductions like this.
30 listeners, let alone 30.
I was like, oh, your eyes are real bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyways, it is a familiar feeling to not be able to see clearly, but I do think God's trying to get my attention on some things. I also think at the same time, we collectively and us personally are seeing so many prayers be answered, like pretty rapid fire. Yeah. And I think when you're contending for something, you're praying for something, you're hoping for something, generally when God answers it, the way that you are hoping he does, there's like a emotional reaction to it. And I found that is also lacking. I'm very grateful, but it's not exciting me that he's answering prayers about resources, specifically our building, stuff for SBS, housing, all of those things. And it's not because I'm not grateful, but I think it's that same thing, that my emotions are not satisfied with God providing physical things, because what he's pointing me to is like, hey, like, it's like lock eyes with me this year. And we talk about in sermons about, like, are you after the promises or after the promise givers and the promise keeper? Promise giver, promise keeper. And I just think that's what I'm feeling this year. God's doing so much, and yet I'm like dissatisfied unless I'm in his presence. Yeah. I think that's part of what he's saying to me. He's allowing me to be dissatisfied, grateful, but dissatisfied.
Well, and I listen, I think that thing you're talking about is actually something that God is doing everywhere. I think when it happens, it like materializes in people differently. Yeah. Right. God can be doing the same thing, but we're different people with different lives and different natural frameworks and personalities. And so it doesn't always look the same, but I can't tell you how many people that I know that there is this holy disruption. Yeah. There is this deep sense of dissatisfaction, but not in an immature way, not in a worldly way. There is just this real work of Jesus it's starting with the condition of our hearts. It's starting with our loves. It's starting with our internal person. And so it's a deeper work. And I think that's a good picture for 2025, a deeper work.
How about you? Do you feel like it is God's doing that in your heart? And if so, how is it? I hate to use the word manifesting because of its cultural meaning, but like, how is it manifesting in your life? Yeah. How is it showing
up? Not with demons, so that's good.
And not with like faith, name it, claim it,
Yeah, I would say that as 2025 is kind of underway, there is this sense in my own heart that what God is after is hard to put language around, but it really is that place of returning to the radical faith and trust that you had at the beginning, but without the ease or the naivety. And one of the things that Emily and I, we met on the mission field. It's a really amazing story. We had both been in college, different stories that led up to it, and we found ourselves in Thailand and randomly, quote unquote, ice skating in Chiang Mai, Thailand, Christmas Day, 2001, fell in love. It's a pretty great story. Gonna send it to Hallmark one of these days. It would make a pretty great Christmas special. But wouldn't it? It happened on Christmas Day. People would be like, this is cheesy and unbelievable.
Perfect.
But and I think a lot of people can recognize this in their own lives. When I look back on those seasons, our entire world was Jesus. And it's not that that's changed, but our entire world was Jesus. Passionate, go anywhere, do anything. But our lives were simpler.
No responsibility except to each other and ourselves.
We got married at 20 and 21. We felt like God was calling us back, and we went and finished school, but we would have gone anywhere, lived anywhere, done anything. We didn't have children, didn't have commitments, didn't have anything tying us down, didn't have debt, there was just this utter freedom. And we also, our faith was young and alive, and it was so vibrant, but it also, now we can look back over the last 20 or so years and see how God has matured it and grown it and tested it and crushed it and rebuilt it and all of those things. So there's that. So what I feel is like there is this invitation from God to return to the radical, zealous beginning, but in a different context that isn't necessarily young, isn't untested, has a lot of commitments, has mostly and most importantly, 4 children and all of these circumstances. And I'm realizing as God is working that out, it is this deeper work, this picture of what is radical obedience when your life is intertwined with all of these things. And I just see how God is after it. And it's really incredible.
So what does that look like to you? Because I think when we talk about, young love for Jesus, untested faith, in a lot of ways, for me, it brings up kind of the connotation of emotional, like in a good way, excited, energetic, and so if people are associating returning to the passion and the flame of their first love for Jesus with emotion, that is not what it necessarily will look like, although hopefully some of that comes back. But like, actually, what does that look like in your life? Like in your life, what you would say to people if it's not the young passion, what does older tested passion look like?
Well, I think emotions can be an element of it, though that's certainly not what I'm talking about. But I think in that context, though, it is an important part of it, because I think that there is, sometimes we have this, false narrative because we have a very high value on emotions, and emotions are God-centered. They're God-given. They're very good. But that heightened emotions make something more real, more powerful, more meaningful, all those kind of things.
Or God is speaking and there's when I feel heightened emotion. There is an emotion to when things begin. Mm-hmm. There's an emotion to when you fall in love. There's an emotion to new experiences. And there's emotions in the first season of following Jesus. So I'm not acting like that isn't true. But what I would say is that those are a gift. That's how your life gets drawn into the things that are most valued. But what I think of when I think of that is I would have gone anywhere and done anything, but it was all viewed through short-term mindset. It was all viewed through the limitations of the things I knew how to do. And what has happened, and this is what God does, this is what love does, this is what maturity does, is you move from the easy external things to the deeper transformation of life. Because most things take time. Most people who are going to come to Christ take time. Most transformation of a city takes time. Most transformation of people take time. Most transformation of marriages take time. And it requires that experience and that deep work. And so what I think is actually, it's almost like an untested, less skilled passion that has all of these moments of God can do this and he can, and God shows up there and he can, but doesn't know how to do the deeper things of transformation. God leads you through this journey where you begin to have this ability, this skill set, this understanding, this knowledge. And part of the scriptures, right? Like that God comforts through you out of the comfort he gives to you in the seasons you walk through. And then James 1 about how God is doing this work and why we can take joy in suffering and hardship and hard seasons, because it's there and it's only there where God does this work of perseverance. And perseverance is actually this piece that God does in my soul of transformation into Christ likeness that is bringing me into my future. A lot of people don't realize that you are incapable of your future until God has established and built up enough perseverance in the middle of you to step into it. And so part of what I think, but what happens, right, is that you go on those long journeys and you can forget, or you can not know how or to hold the both and. I really do think it's a work of the Spirit, where then God is, as he's established this other work, he begins to reach back and bring to it the fullness of it, that it has every element, every obedience, every desire, every passion. And I just think it's part of how God operates in our lives. We just live in a long transformation journey with Jesus.
And sometimes I think we forget that every season is making us whole. Every season is making us full. So I think that's what I'm seeing God do. He's maturing, right? True love is mature love. True faith is mature faith. True transformation is mature transformation. And I think he's just bringing people into that place of maturity again. So I'm really excited for 2025. And I almost look back on the last 5-6 years and I go, okay, God, you've done a lot of testing, a lot of perseverance, a lot of deep work. And I just can't quite explain it. It's not an emotion. It's just that sense in my own spirit that you're about to put it to work. There's something you've been establishing for a long time and you're about to put it to a really, really good work. So I'm all in. And it bleeds into what we want to talk about today. And on today's podcast, we have a special guest called us, me and Emily. Part of it, it's budget cuts. We were, moving into 2025. No, we actually wanted
Banning's
to.
And be like, wait, other people got paid?
Anybody's getting paid? Just kidding. We wanted to take an episode and just have a conversation together and talk about specifically just the simplicity of the invitation of following Jesus. Part of it is that as we have all of these conversations and our heart about this hope of resistance and renewal, and what does it mean to really engage in the culture we live within, that there are so many moments and stories of what God has been doing in our life, in the past, in the present, and just having an opportunity to lean into those. And so that's what I want to start with this question, because I do believe this. I believe even in what we talked about, what God's doing in both of us, there is a picture that is this truth that Jesus is at all times inviting us back to the place of following him. And when you look at the stories of the scriptures and Jesus comes back to this, and almost every single time that he speaks about this invitation to follow him, it's places where the disciples or the crowds or those that are engaged with him have deviated in some way from the left or the right, or they have to take a step into something else. It's a journey from one place to another. And in those moments, Jesus looks at them and he says, follow me. And I really believe that as Christians, we have to return to the initial invitation of Jesus. He is asking us to follow him. And something that we say all the time is that actually Jesus never asked us to be a Christian. He asked us to be his disciples. I have no problem with the label Christian. I'm proud to be a Christian. But we have to remember that the core invitation of Jesus isn't to simply believe something. It's to have a whole life embodied expression of following Jesus, wherever he goes, whatever he does, whoever he is, that we follow him. And I think we have to reclaim that. And so I want to ask you this, of just even in that concept, what does it mean to follow Jesus? We say this is one of those Christian words. But when we look at that invitation of Jesus to follow him, he said, follow me. What does it mean to actually follow Jesus?
Well, it's a loaded question, I think. I'm first reminded of when he says, take up your cross and follow me. Yeah. I actually think that gives a lot more context to it, because obviously we're looking in the scriptures where he's talking to actual people in actual time that actually had to follow him, like they dropped their nets and they followed him. There was an immediate physical activity to it in the context of the Gospels that then we have to, find out, interpret what that means for us today, and using the epistles to help us figure out what a life following Jesus means. But I think that to take up your cross and follow me actually kind of paints the whole story. Is like, to follow Jesus means you go where he went first. And I'm spending a lot of time in Hebrews lately, and talking about how he's the pioneer, the perfecter of our faith, how that he is, it was fitting that the Lord would that God would have him be like his brothers and sisters in all respects, having been perfected through obedience and suffering unto death. And so it's kind of like there's this trajectory to following Jesus. It is not nebulous, and you need to have your cross ready at any time to get crucified. So the trajectory of following Jesus is towards suffering and death.
Yeah.
That to me is something that many people haven't wrestled through.
Yeah.
We know we might XYZ get persecuted, like the word persecution.
Just having a light episode here.
Yeah, but it's
Resistance
not
and Renewal podcast.
That Jesus made a way into heaven by being obedient, suffering, and dying. And so to follow him means to be obedient and to suffer and to be willing to die.
Yeah.
And then when we are buried with him, then we raise with him, suffer with him, we're glorified with him. So I think it's just there's spiritual practices, and there's there's scriptures all over past the Gospels that tells you how to live as a believer. But I think that the short answer, which is I'm kind of a short answer kind of girl, is to be obedient to what he says. And there are things he says in the scripture to be obedient, and then there's things he says to us through his spirit to be obedient to. Yeah. So
I think that it's, one of the things we do, even in that invitation, right? You see it, Mark 8, Matthew 16, Luke 9. Jesus has this consequential conversation with the disciples, and all of them, he invites them to follow him. It's after the revelation of who he is. And he immediately goes to the place of where he will suffer and die, and he invites the disciples to pick up their cross. And I do think, and I get this, we have such a hard time sometimes not we read the Bible from the post-resurrection perspective. And it's not that that's fundamentally wrong. Sometimes though, we have to slow down, and if we do that, we miss the power of the invitation. When you actually sit with the disciples and Jesus is saying this to them, there is no imagery of the cross but a Roman tool of torture and murder. There's
slaves, for foreigners, for Roman citizens couldn't be crucified. So it's not just that it was torturous and horrible, but it's like a status as well, like 100%. For the lowest dregs of society.
And it's not that these are exactly type for type, but it, as if hearing Jesus say, pick up your guillotine or pick up your firing squad. There was no understanding that they had other than this was pick up the very thing that's going to murder you. And obviously there is multiple meanings in it. And there is the symbolism of laying down your life. There is what we now know and the disciples knew about death and resurrection and the promises of God and new creation and all of these things.
But they didn't know that then.
But they didn't know it then. And I do think that we have to sometimes allow the soberness of the picture to be present in that, because Jesus is inviting us to pick up our cross. So whatever he meant to them, he still means to us. And I believe that it's really, there's that desire in us to just make it so simple, to make it only spiritual or emotional. And that there is tension because our Father loves us. He wants blessing for us. He's not a masochist. He doesn't desire to hurt us. He desires to see us flourish, but that there is an invitation into obedience with Jesus that will lead us through trials, hardship, and suffering, that it's in our obedience to Jesus in the midst of them that not only we find the way of Jesus, but we find the transformation of Jesus in the process. And so I do think that it's one of those things. When was the last time we actually let Jesus say, "Hey, I'm really calling you to your willingness to lay down your life, even if it costs you your life"?
Yeah, I mean, the New Testament is constantly exhorting the reader that to persevere in suffering. I mean, it's all over. Peter does it. John does it. Paul does it. The author of Hebrews does it. It's not a distinct perspective. It is the perspective of being a follower of Jesus, is that you will suffer. There's various reasons, sometimes discipline, sometimes consequence of sin, sometimes because of spiritual warfare, sometimes because of injustice. But the idea that we sometimes have this very kind of, I don't know the right descriptor of it, but this idea that even we see the Jewish people that Jesus is talking to had of like, suffering is a consequence of God's displeasure.
Yeah.
That suffering, why is this man lame? Is it because he sinned or his parents? Those were their only two paradigms.
Yeah.
Either he sinned or his parents, and Jesus goes, neither.
Yeah.
And so we have adopted that, at least in the American church. And I don't think it's actually everywhere, because I think a lot of Christians suffer a lot more than we do. But we think if we are suffering, something is wrong and it needs to be fixed.
Yeah.
And
I agree with that.
the Bible teaches us that if we are suffering, Jesus is with us.
Yeah.
If we are suffering, we have a great comforter. And even in Hebrews, this, the really famous Hall of Faith passage that starts in Hebrews 11, it's so beautiful. And you're like, yeah, we love the faithful people of God. And then you get to the end and it ends like this. And I just think it's so beautiful and so sobering. 11. And it says, so it's talking about these people of faith. It says, through faith, conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. And we're thinking, yeah, like I want to be in the hall of faith. Like that's amazing.
Yeah.
And then next line, some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and in caves of the earth. Like, keeping faith, following Jesus might have its victories along the way, but it also might end in desolation, persecution, torture, and death. And the author of Hebrews is saying, like, both mark a life of faith. And for us to ignore that part of following Jesus, like you said in the beginning, it leaves us immature, because we do mature through suffering. We know Jesus more because he suffered. It's not like we know Jesus more just because he sits with us more. We know Jesus more because, like, God suffered. And if we want to become more like God and to know God more, then we learn that in suffering. And it has nothing to do with how good he is and nothing to do with how much he loves us.
So you're telling me that Chick-fil-A being closed on Sunday is not my cross to bear?
Well, you can couple it with like Hibachi Express being closed on Monday.
It's a little deeper than that.
The 1-2
I
punch.
really do crave it on Sunday. It's the weirdest thing.
It's a weird thing.
I mean, and I know
That's
this.
spiritual warfare.
I just
remember that.
I have driven to Chick-fil-A on Sunday so many times. Remember that time
We went to two different ones.
because we were like, why is that Chick-fil-A
So bizarre.
closed? And it just
We drove to one, it was
the
closed.
spiritual
We were
blindness.
like, oh, weird. We drove to another one, we're like, oh.
No, but it's
weird.
But obviously, there is that place where I think we have cheapened it. But it's also challenging to know, what does this verse look like and mean in our lives? What does this invitation
Yeah, and there's
look
also
like and
like,
mean in our
if
lives?
we aren't suffering on a daily basis, we're still following Jesus. So like, there's that side of it, but then there's the other side that, hey, my life looks pretty great right now. how do I follow
Yeah.
Jesus in this? It's not
Well-
just a trajectory, right? Like there's a trajectory following Jesus that's towards the cross, but there's also the step that you take on that trajectory.
And I do think that we have to mature in this area. And I think it's one of the things that God is doing. We view suffering as a sign of his absence.
Yeah.
And
Or injustice.
And the truth is that the scriptures actually tell us that suffering is a sign of his presence. And even what Paul says, that I want to know Christ and the heights of his resurrection and the depths of his suffering. There is a knowing of Jesus that only comes through both. And God does want us to know him in the heights, in the beauty, in the glory, in the power of resurrection.
And that's the final story. I mean, that's the good news, is that it's the suffering will end. It will end, but the glory won't end.
And I think this is what I would even say to people. There is a knowing of God that only happens in hardship. And often we want around that. And that's part of being human. It's a distinct part of our culture. Our culture's value of everything pointing towards present happiness, everything pointing towards immediate euphoria, makes it, in some ways, we want to cancel suffering from every part of our life.
And then accuse God. I mean, that's another thing that there's, when we think we have a value that's higher than God's value, then we get the authority to accuse him.
Yeah.
And that we have valued happiness and comfort above what God values it.
Yeah.
And so then we accuse him when we don't have it.
And I think here's I think a really important thing to kind of see. So the invitation to follow Jesus is exactly that. To believe him, to follow him, to go where he goes, to do what he does, to embody his life. And I think for anyone who actually wants to follow Jesus, there is this recognition that where he wants to take your life will require suffering. It doesn't mean it's only suffering, but it will require it. And so I think there is that place of saying, hey, if you have excused or don't know how to hold this tension, you're actually robbing your own future. Because until we are willing to follow Jesus into difficulty, we're not willing to follow Jesus. And it's not, again, it's not that God wants our lives to be marked by pain, but it is that place of saying he has something so important. Things that are truly meaningful, the things that are of deepest value, are only things that are worth suffering for. And I can't stop sometimes but think about how many people are actually not living in the fullness of who they've been created to be, because the road there requires hardship they're not willing to consider.
Yeah. And God also oftentimes, I mean, sometimes hardship falls upon us, but sometimes he puts the path in front of us and we choose to go through it or not. I mean, I would say like healing from wounds in our past is like a hardship that distinctly people don't want to do the work to get through.
And people, people will
and
often,
it's hard, but God lets you choose not to.
Yeah. And I've had this conversation with many people. They're like, well, explain to me, Jesus says, come to me, all who are weary, I'll give you rest. My yoke is easy. My burden is light. And it's incredible and true. And that almost those two pictures of how do you pick up your cross. And also Jesus says, my burden is light. How is a cross light? And I think we forget that both of these pictures are telling the both and is telling the full story. But what Jesus doesn't mean when he says my burden is light is that my burden is a 401k account, that my burden is you're eventually going to get to this home. My burden, we Americanize that. And what Jesus is actually saying is, hey, by the way, the burden of forgiveness is a lighter burden than the burden of bitterness. The burden of love is a lighter burden than the burden of hate. And I'm not canceling out that Jesus really is someone we fall at his feet. We let his strength restore us. He cares for us. He comforts us. But I think there is that picture, and to me it goes to this, because I agree with you, and I know you're going to be in alignment with what I'm saying. I think that while that invitation to pick up our cross is central, there are other pieces that make the story fuller. And I think actually, when you look at all of the scenarios where Jesus invites us to follow him, it begins to paint that wider picture, right? Because Jesus is a rabbi. He's using rabbinical language. This was a normal thing that rabbis would invite their disciples. It was a mark of invitation to a life of discipleship, and it had inherent meaning in the midst of it.
Yeah.
But I even think of the three major moments that we see Jesus invite Peter to follow him. And each one of these to me has a piece of what it means. The first, right? The very first moment, he's at the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And he says, right now you're a fisherman, but I'm going to make you fishers of men. I think there is an invitation to follow Jesus that is about finding out who you really are, that you could only know who you really are. There's a life that God has for you, but it is a life that is discovered as you follow him. And then, of course, the one we're talking about, Caesarea Philippi, Jesus shares that he's going to suffer and die, and he calls them to pick up their cross and follow him, that they must become last, they must become servants. That to be great in the kingdom, as Jesus says a little bit later, is not to become like the lords of the Gentiles or the rulers of the age. It's to become last. So it's this invitation to dying to self, and to being willing to lay down whatever is required. This invitation. So the first invitation is about to follow Jesus, to find out life, about who you really are. The second invitation is really an invitation to laying down your life and finding out who Jesus is and the cost of following him. And then the very last one, right, in the reconciliation of Peter, where as Jesus is restoring him, what does he keep saying? He keeps saying, feed my lambs, feed my sheep, care for others. Even before Peter betrays Jesus, Jesus looks at him and he says, Peter, when you've returned, care for your brothers. They're going to need you, Peter. Strengthen yourself. Like, care for them. And this final invitation that there is a following Jesus that is about loving others. And there is certainly more, but I just think about those three pictures. An invitation to my future, an invitation to suffer for what matters and to obey Jesus at all costs, and an invitation that I would pour out my life for the sake of others. And I just think about those three things and how much God wants to do that in this season and how much God has done that in our lives. And then the stories start to go backwards and you're like, oh, I've been in a school my entire life, the school of following Jesus.
Yeah.
He's been teaching me about who I really am. He's been teaching me about dying to myself. He's been teaching me about giving my life away for others. And I honestly, I would love to hear this. When you think about your own story, what God has done, what for you are the most shaping moments as a follower of Jesus? Where have you learned to follow Jesus the most in your life? What were they?
I think there's various examples of each, but I'd say they all fall into two categories. I think when I have heard the voice of God clearly, it is so compelling. Every time it happens, it marks my life. Like, I can't experience it. And I think that there's that piece that if people aren't walking in the not ability, but when people aren't walking in the practice of listening for God's voice and hearing him, and some people just have been taught that can't happen anymore. But I would say, I mean, like, when he spoke to me about going to YWAM, like, changed my life. It changed my life, the direction of my life, my faith walk, meeting you. It was just so clear. And I can look back to that point and say, oh, God had a plan for my life and he spoke to me and I heard him and I obeyed. When I was on my DTS, we did this thing called Kona Conquest, where you're supposed to pack up your outreach bag and have it for 3 days and be like, basically, if you can't carry what you need for 3 days, you're not going to make it on outreach, was kind of like the sense of it. And then they just dropped us off in the mountains on the Big Island, and we had to like walk around with a map, team building, all that stuff. But I remember I was asleep. We had outside, no tents. I was in a sleeping bag, and I just woke up as wide awake as I've ever been. And I just looked up and I could see the Milky Way kind of for the first time in my life, because I'd always been either not in a place I could see it or around too many lights, but you're just like up on kind of the cliffs on the island and you can just see the Milky Way. And the Lord said to me so clearly, I just wanted to wake you up to show you this. I fell back asleep. I mean, loud, clear. It was like wet. There were crickets all over. I remember really distinctly, there were crickets all over me. I'm like, well, I'll never be able to fall asleep. Fell right back asleep. Like total peace, presence of the Lord. That had no purpose in my life except delight.
Yeah.
God was delighting in sharing a moment with me. I mean, that marked my faith in God. And it didn't, the first one gave me direction and a husband and a ministry. And the second one was just a father being like, hey, I want to show you something.
Yeah.
So both those times had different outcomes, but they were both hearing the voice of God. That is like, it confirms my faith, but it marks my life. It teaches me something about God every time that happens so clearly. And I think you get senses. I mean, we pray and we have big decisions, we fast. And I think our discernment is very high, and the Lord speaks through our discernment, and the Lord speaks through the Bible. The Lord speaks through, prophetic prayers of other people and dreams. But there are some times where it's the Lord's voice, as audible as it can be in your head, that marks you. That would be one thing. I'd say the second category is when I give generously. And I think that is a distinct mark the Lord has called me to, because it really excites me. And I think every time the Lord has asked me to give generously, the fruit of it in my own life, in people's lives, in the lives of watching my kids learn it, is like, it's the most encouraging part of my walk with God, outside of like the quiet place intimacy with him. Like in my walk with God, in reference to the people.
Yeah.
It's when I give generously, and kind of like this game in my head with the Lord. It's like, the first number you tell me is what I'm going to give. And I just trust you to put a number in my head faster than I do. And then I tell you the number, and you have to wrestle with it a little bit more.
Wrestle with it.
But honestly,
you and Jesus have a bank account I don't know about.
Yeah. But that's so fun. But really, and I don't think that's for everyone. It's not like a exhortation that everyone needs to be giving more generously, but to me, that's where the Lord teaches me. He moves
X amount
me.
Is the Lord, but I would encourage everyone to give more generously.
But it's just like, when I am awakened by practice and experience to the generosity of God's heart, it marks my life with Jesus.
It's fascinating for me to hear kind of what comes to your mind.
Yeah.
And then contrast it about what immediately comes to my mind. Because when I think about the most shaping moments in my life of following Jesus, and maybe some of this is because I'm so familiar with the really big moments in my life, and I share them, and but
teach on them.
What I think about is when I've failed, and the responses. Like I think about when we were living in Southern California, and I was 22, and we were leaders at our church, and Dave Metzger, who was a mentor in our life, and I was highly involved in learning ministry, and he gave me so many opportunities, and he saw this gift, an anointing and on my life, and made room for me that I hadn't earned or deserved, but he saw me and loved me and valued me. And I was young. I was overwhelmed. I was overcommitted. Patterns in my life that I couldn't see until much later.
Well, it's just patterns in your life that didn't affect you negatively until you had a responsibility.
Right. And I had a pure heart. Yeah. So actually it was interesting how much I minimized some of these things because my heart was good. My desire was pure. But I, had a very difficult time keeping a calendar, simple things. And I think I had missed several meetings. I had stood one or two people up, and it had become a repeated pattern. And I still remember Dave sitting me down at outside. We were outside at this table in Southern California, and he just starts to address it. And I remember him looking at me and going, "If you continue to treat people like this, you will no longer be allowed to be in leadership in any form of my church. I will no longer allow you to do this to people." And I remember that moment.
I remember you telling me about it. I remember that day.
my initial reaction was, I think happens to a lot of us, was offense.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, immediately what I went to, you know how much I'm doing, Dave?
Yeah.
Because I was. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm getting paid, Dave? Nothing. I was like an intern. My immediate reaction was self-defense. Look at all I'm doing. Look at all I'm pouring out. Come on, have a little, it was this, and while those things were true-ish, they were all the ways that I was hiding, the things I was hiding behind. And the grace of having somebody look at me and go, hey, you're hurting people. And when you, as a leader, are doing this, there is no excuse good enough.
Yeah.
And the pain of it, the searing pain of it. And I think about how much that moment changed my life. And then I think about other moments or where I made mistakes. I remember, another leader in my life who had shared something with me of massive consequence and was inviting me into through a leadership moment to be aware of a story that I should not have known about. And it wasn't that he was gossiping to me. He was mentoring me and inviting me in. There was all of these elements of it. And then I was young and I didn't willy-nilly share it, but there was another person who I just assumed knew, how could they not know if I had been invited in, noting their status or role or place? So I shared this thing and he didn't know and he wasn't supposed to know. And I realized I had betrayed confidence. I remember that moment. I felt an internal grief. And I remember Dan, who was the person who invited me into this and entrusted that to me. I came and I shared with him, and the grace that he showed me, like the mercy he showed me. And I just think about both of those moments and how much they have shaped my understanding and the transformation. And one is a picture of a father who was willing to correct me where I was blind. And another was a picture of another father who was willing to show me mercy in my failure, and which would have been true of both of them. But man, those moments changed my life. And I just think, I think that so much of learning how to follow Jesus is being willing to follow him and know that you're going to make mistakes and you're going to screw up. I mean, is this not part of the invitation of the Gospels? They kept getting it wrong, yet Jesus kept making room. But it wasn't passive. It wasn't like he looked at them and goes, it doesn't matter. It all matters.
Yeah.
But his response of both correction and mercy time and time again. And we need that. And I just think one of the things we need in this season more than almost anything is the heart to go after it. Follow Jesus. And you know what? You're going to not get everything right. You're going to find yourself in situations you don't know what to do. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to make mistakes because you're blind. You're going to make mistakes because you're young or young in experience. And may God bring the kind of people who embody Jesus in that moment, both his challenge and his correction, but his love and faithfulness and mercy. Because I think it's those moments that shape us.
So let me ask you, so when you talk about those two moments, they're also, they're leadership moments. You are in ministry leadership. You're in ministry now. And it's the way they taught you specifically how to receive and pour out to others. How does that affect your relationship with God himself? Like, how does, like you say, you're going to mess up and you need his correction and his, like, so not person to person, but your heart to God's heart. How do you encourage people to be corrected by the Lord?
Yeah.
And also be in his grace? Because I think sometimes we do one really well and not the other.
Yeah.
And sometimes we just flip flop between the two of them like a fish out of water because we don't know.
Yeah.
We're just more strung along by shame and sin than we are by correction and grace.
Yeah.
So like, how did those things teach you about God? Not necessarily how you relate to others, but just how you relate to God.
Yeah. Well, I think that it is through people that God widens our ability to know him. And that's what we miss.
Yeah.
I don't, yes, those are some of those moments that are distinctly connected to leadership. But I think that's the heart of Jesus for everybody, that he wants everyone he views in a leader, whether you have a title or not. And what I would say is the only way you're going to find the fullness of the character of God is because you allow him to bring people in your life who reveal it. Yeah. I can read about a Jesus who corrects, and I can read about a Jesus who has mercy. But when I found the Jesus who corrects through Dave and loved me, and I needed it, and he sat with me through all of my selfish, guttural response. Don't you see me, Dave? Right? Don't you see all that I'm doing? And he made room for all of my flesh to have to get on the table to go, oh, he does see me. Oh my gosh, he actually sees me so much. He cares so deeply about me, and he cares deeply about other people. And then to have a moment where you feel such shame, and I've had other moments where I feel shame, but then to have somebody come and embody grace, it begins to widen the view of the accurate picture of who God is. And what I would say back to your point is that I do think we have these frameworks where we are probably more used to correction and challenge, or more used to grace and mercy. And what I would say is that you can deceive yourself in one of those categories. Yeah. So what we need to be putting ourselves around people who widen that. And following Jesus is going to lead you to people. I know that sounds like one of the most obvious statements in the world, but I really do think it is. And I would encourage anyone who's listening, Jesus is trying to point you towards people, and you need to be putting your life around people you trust that can speak into you, whether they're peers, whether they're mentors, that it is that voice of others as they are following Jesus, right? I just think about what Paul said to Timothy. I'm entrusting something to you that you need to entrust to someone else. Faithful that people. You cannot undo the discipleship process of following Jesus. Yeah. And it's where we learn how to follow him. And so, so many other things I want to say, but let me close here. I want to close on a question because I think, this is the heart, and this is the heart so many people have, but it feels like it's so easy to get disrupted. Life gets full, life gets busy. What are the challenges that people face in the everyday? Like what is robbing people from really following Jesus? And what would be your encouragement to them? Let me paint a really loving, faithful follower of Jesus that just wants to follow him and says, but how? Yeah. I love him, but how? What would you say to them?
You are my husband, so you have the most intimate look into my life. So you know when I say I'm not big on routine, it's true. It's not that I'm not big on it, like conceptually. I just do it very poorly. We don't have dinner at the same time every night. Sometimes I don't have a dinner plan at all because I have this condition, Chris calls it, where I just I snack a ton at 4 and then my family's hungry at 5. I'm like, what do you mean? And it's because I had just made myself food. And so I've always been pretty sensitive to this idea of like rhythm and routine with Jesus is the way to like grow in faith with him, because it's not my strength. And I'm not saying that we don't need to like disciplines. Disciplines are vitally important, and that rhythm and routine isn't good. Like it is a weakness of mine that I don't naturally do, and I work rhythm and routine into my life. But I also think as a mother of 4, I can look at some of the expectations that seem implicitly put on believers as really more like those extra laws the Pharisees added on. Like, do I think a daily quiet time is important with Jesus? Absolutely. Do I think that looks like me in a quiet room with a Bible and coffee and worship music?
Only in your fantasies.
Only in my deepest, wildest dreams, right? we have to learn how to meet God anywhere.
Yeah.
I think that is a key. And if we can meet God anywhere, he can meet us anywhere.
Yeah.
I love a quiet time in this room when it's like clean and tidy and no one's home. I love it. But I get just as much time with the Lord when I'm going to bed at night. You come to bed a little bit later than me. It's just kind of our rhythm. I have probably 20 to 30 minutes of prayer with the Lord that I write things down. I have a little notebook, or I don't, and I'm mad the next day because I forgot. But he teaches me things in those moments. He teaches me things when I'm driving. Any time that I have space, I know how to get to the Lord. And some of that is finding that secret place with the Lord in your mind. And we can talk about kind of a practice to do in that. So that's one thing. I think sometimes we're like, oh, if we can't fit in the scheduled routine, then it's a wash. Kind of like, if I didn't work out today, I'll just start tomorrow. And it's like, that mentality has to change. Find a way to be able to meet God anywhere is one thing I would say. And then the other thing, we're Bible teachers. We love the Bible. I think a lot of people know that reading the Bible is important, and a lot of people still don't do it. Yeah. And I don't just mean read the Bible because it is a discipline. I mean, read the Bible because there are things that you are supposed to believe that you don't know. You're supposed to believe. The faith that I was taught in Sunday school was firm, solid, but it was paltry compared to everything that's in here. And sometimes it's these big revelations the Lord will give you that you're like, again, we've been talking about Hebrews. I don't want to give anything away for, people who are going to study it on their own. But some things the author of Hebrews says, you're like, wait, what? Yeah. I didn't know that. And the implications. And then sometimes it's those short little poppy lists that Paul gives that he's like, honor everyone.
Get your mind blown by the Bible again.
Oh my gosh. You're like, wait. I guess it's Peter that says honor. Yeah. Peter says honor everyone. And then he says honor the emperor who was killing Christians. You're like, hey, if Christians, 2 words, honor everyone. If Christians did that, can you imagine how different the world would be? How different people would look at our faith? So
it's so true.
On one hand, there's everyone knows the disciplines of quiet time and Bible, and they might have an idea of why it's failing. I would say keep the disciplines, but you have to find ways that it becomes practical and doable in your life.
Well, I think this is the right place to close. I think the invitation to follow Jesus starts in your real life.
Right, because he gave you your real life. I think
so many people,
he gave you your neighbors,
struggle to finally follow Jesus because they close their eyes and they see the idealized life they want. They're like, okay, I can do this thing and that thing and cut that thing and move this thing and then make this thing and I can start up this routine and do this thing I've never done my entire life, but I can start it tomorrow. And it's like, hey, yeah, mature, sure. I want you to get more mature. I want to get more mature. And maybe there's some of those pieces that are more mature. But why don't you start here where I actually think Jesus wants to start? Follow him in your real life. Mm-hmm. Find him in your real life.
Worship him.
Find him in your real life. Do the dishes and stop for a minute and go, Jesus, you're here. I love you. I want to follow you. If you have something to say to me, will you talk to me while I do the dishes? Just read the Bible for 2 minutes on your way into work. Start inviting the Spirit into meetings before you go into them.
Yeah.
Take moments. It's just the little things. Jesus actually really loves the real you. He doesn't want to hang with the fake you. He really likes you, and he wants to teach you as you are, in what you are, in the midst of what's going on, to follow you. And follow him.
Also, I think, man, it's a lot safer to be spending time with Jesus in a nice decorated room with a quiet house and a clean table and a new notebook than it is to be following him in the grocery store. Because what he can say to you here is nice. You write it down.
Yeah.
What he says to you in the grocery store is go lay hands on that person and pray for their healing.
That feeling.
Oh yeah.
You know that feeling everybody's
where
watching where the Spirit's asking you to do something.
What happens to you?
Reclaim it. That's
my heart starts beating really fast, and I'm no.
Remember when you first followed Jesus?
Yeah.
And there was that feeling?
the constancy of the
Sounded
not
excellent.
perfect life
So good.
is how he invites us into the real work he wants to do in the world.
Well, as always, we talked for a long time
And
and
answered
we have
nothing.
about 1,000 more things we want to say. So hopefully we get into those 30s.
Yes. Yeah.
I love you. Let's follow
love you
Jesus.
too, babe.
And I really believe it matters. Just encourage everyone as you're listening to this today, wherever you are. Follow Jesus. Follow Jesus right now. Talk to him about it and let him come into your real life. And we'll keep moving forward, yeah?
Yeah. In Jesus' name.
All right. That was fun.
Amen.